Okay, so you want to own a funeral home. Good news. There are over 19,000 of them in the United States, and unlike almost every other business you could buy, this one has a customer base that never stops growing. Literally. Here's the number that should stop you before you sign anything. Caskets are frequently marked up 300 to 500% over wholesale cost, meaning a casket that cost the funeral home around $600 can end up on a family's bill closer to $3,000 to $5,000. That gap isn't the strange part. The strange part is that almost nobody in that room ever questions it. It sounds like the most recession-proof business on earth. Death doesn't care about the economy. Nobody skips a funeral because interest rates went up, and in a lot of ways, that's true. But here's what almost nobody tells you before they buy one. The paperwork is regulated so tightly by the federal government that a serious compliance mistake can trigger real penalties and put a business's ability to operate at serious risk. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly where the real profit in this industry hides, why families almost never negotiate even when they're legally allowed to, and the one shift in American death itself that's quietly rewriting the entire business model. Let's start with what people actually pay, because the sticker price alone tells you almost nothing about where this industry's money actually comes from. The median cost of a traditional funeral with viewing and burial in the United States sits at around $8,300, according to the National Funeral Directors Association. Add the cemetery plot, the vault, the headstone, and the total climbs to somewhere between $11,000 and $13,000. For a cremation with a memorial service, families pay roughly $6,500. Direct cremation, no service at all, can run as low as $1,095. Four completely different price points, four completely different profit stories hiding underneath each one, and almost every family only ever sees the one number on their own invoice. Now let's go back to that $600 casket. Caskets are the single largest line item on almost every traditional funeral bill, marked up 300 to 500% over what the funeral home actually paid for them wholesale. Picture that number sitting anywhere else in your life. You walk into a car dealership and get shown a $600 item with a $5,000 price tag. And instead of questioning it, you buy it within the hour. No negotiation, no second opinion, no shopping around. That's not because funeral directors are unusually good salespeople. It's because of something economists call a captive market. And once you see how it actually works, you can't unsee it anywhere else in life either. This is what actually happens inside that casket room, and it has almost nothing to do with dishonesty. A grieving family walks into a funeral home, usually within 24 to 48 hours of a death, exhausted, overwhelmed, and under enormous social pressure to do right by the person who died. They are shown the casket room. Industry research on buyer behavior has found something the FTC itself has flagged as significant. Most shoppers end up choosing from among the first three models a director shows them, generally settling on the middle-priced option, which gives the funeral home every incentive to lead with pricier caskets first. Nobody is lying to them. Every price is disclosed exactly as federal law requires. But the emotional state of the buyer, combined with which three caskets happen to come out first, does more selling than any salesperson ever could. Except there's a deeper problem underneath even that. It's not just the room, it's the clock. Most families are making this decision within a single afternoon, often the same afternoon they identified a body at a hospital or a coroner's office. There is no version of this purchase where someone drives home, sleeps on it, and comes back tomorrow with three competing quotes. The entire transaction is designed not maliciously, just structurally, to happen once, fast, and under duress. This is the same principle behind why a casino stays profitable, even though every single game mathematically favors the house. It's not the odds alone, it's the environment built around the odds. A funeral home doesn't need trick pricing. It just needs grief, urgency, and a room arranged in a very specific order. Federal law actually tries to fix part of this, and the fix is more powerful than almost anyone realizes. Picture this instead of a checklist. Walk into any funeral home in the country and ask, and by law, they have to hand you a full itemized price list on the spot. Call first, and they still have to give you real price information over the phone before you ever walk through the door. You can refuse embalming in most cases. You can decline every single add-on and pay only for the exact services you actually want. You can even order a casket online from a completely different company, have it delivered straight to the funeral home, and they're legally required to accept it without charging you a penny in handling fees. Almost nobody does any of this. Not because the law is hidden. It's posted, disclosed, mandatory. It's because asking a funeral director to justify a price list while your mother is lying in the next room feels, to almost every human being on earth, completely impossible in the moment. The law protects you on paper. Grief makes sure you almost never use it. And this is where the math starts to get complicated in the other direction, because owning one of these places is nowhere near as lucrative as that casket markup alone might suggest. Fixed operating costs for a funeral home typically run between $215,000 and $675,000 a year, and staff wages alone eat up 40 to 50% of that before a single casket is ever sold. Net profit margins across the industry land somewhere between 10 and 20%, with traditional burial homes running higher than cremation-focused ones, because, as you now understand, burial comes bundled with more of that merchandise upside. A single-location funeral home serving 100 to 200 families a year generates around $1 million in annual revenue. Sounds substantial until every fixed cost, every variable cost, every staff wage gets subtracted. What's left as business profit is real, but it's rarely the windfall the casket markups alone might suggest. And how much of that actually reaches an owner's pocket depends on debt payments, how the business is structured, and what gets reinvested versus distributed each year. Here's the one sentence worth remembering out of all of that. Huge markup on paper does not automatically mean huge take-home pay in practice, and confusing the two can make this business look far more lucrative than it actually is. Except there's a problem, and it's the kind of problem that doesn't show up on any single balance sheet. It shows up in the industry's long-term trend lines. Cremation has now overtaken burial as the most common choice in the United States, with industry projections placing it at roughly 61% of deaths in 2026, up from around 30% in 2010. And cremation is dramatically less profitable for the funeral home. There's no premium casket sale in most cases, no expensive vault requirement, no elaborate viewing setup driving facility fees. A full-service cremation with a memorial still generates revenue, but it produces 30 to 50% less than a traditional burial, because so much of a burial's profit was never really about the burial itself. It was about everything sold around it. And this is where the parallel becomes almost impossible to ignore. It's the exact same story as the gas station that makes almost nothing on fuel and survives entirely on the convenience store attached to the pumps. The funeral home's version of that convenience store was the casket room, the flowers, the printed programs, the guest book, the transportation fleet. As cremation keeps climbing, a huge percentage of that secondary revenue simply stops happening, and owners are left scrambling to invent new add-ons, keepsake jewelry made from ashes, scattering ceremonies, online memorial pages, anything to rebuild the margin that burial used to provide automatically. Some operators saw this coming years ago and adapted by leaning hard into what's called pre-need sales, arranging and paying for a funeral years or even decades before anyone actually needs it. These programs now account for 30 to 40% of revenue at many successful funeral homes, and the reason isn't the one you'd expect. It's not that pre-need sales carry a bigger markup. It's that once a family signs a pre-need contract, that relationship is effectively locked in. When the actual need eventually arrives, years or decades later, there's no shopping around in the middle of a crisis, because the decision and the provider was already made. A pre-need sale secures a decision while nobody involved is grieving. There's no emotional urgency, no casket room staged under warm lighting, no exhausted family trying to get through the worst week of their life. Just a calm conversation about eventual certainty. It doesn't need the captive market pressure that drives casket markups because it's solving a completely different problem, converting a one-time emotional transaction into contracted future business, secured years before the emotional version would have even started. Now imagine owning 1,500 of these places at once, and here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little. There's a real chance the small, family-run funeral home in your own hometown, the one with the familiar local name that's been on that sign for 3 generations, isn't actually family-run anymore. Service Corporation International, the largest funeral and cemetery operator in North America, spent decades quietly buying up small, independent funeral homes across the country, and then doing something unusual, leaving the original family name on the building, not out of sentiment, because grieving families trust a familiar local name infinitely more than a corporate one, and SCI understood that trust was the actual asset they were purchasing, not just the building or the hearse fleet. Today, SCI operates nearly 1,500 funeral service locations and 500 cemeteries, generating billions in annual revenue, built substantially on that same pre-need model, scaled far beyond what any single independent owner could match. The company didn't need to outmarket anyone or compete on price. It just understood, decades before most of the industry caught on, that the real business wasn't the 24 hours after a death. It was every single year leading up to it. Here's what this actually means for you, whether you ever own one of these businesses or not. The funeral home industry's real story isn't really about death at all. It's about a business that used to run entirely on a 24-hour window of grief and is now racing to get out of that window altogether. The old model was built on those 24 hours immediately following a death, the narrow, emotionally overwhelming window where a family has to make 5-figure decisions with no time to shop around and no appetite left to negotiate. That's where the casket markups lived, where the captive market did its work, where an entire industry's profit quietly depended on nobody having time to think. Cremation is dismantling that model piece by piece, and the smartest operators didn't respond by defending the old window harder. They responded by making it irrelevant, locking families in years, sometimes decades, before that window ever opens. You don't need to feel cynical about any of this to understand it. Funeral directors, by every account, do genuinely difficult, necessary work during the worst moment of a family's life. But understanding the economics changes what you notice the next time you're standing in that room, or filling out a pre-need brochure at a kitchen table with no urgency at all. The casket room was never really selling caskets. It was selling certainty. At the exact moment, certainty was the one thing money couldn't actually buy anywhere else. The smartest players in this industry figured out how to sell that same certainty years earlier before grief ever had the chance to set the price.